Well, I would like to thank very much the Zvi Yavets School of Historical Studies for its kind invitation, and especially my friend Aviad Kleinberg. It's only the second time we meet. The first time I did not remember because there was a lot of people, and I'm sorry. And afterwards, I think that I knew very well Aviad because I translated a marvelous book of his, and The Central God. And when you translate somebody, you know him from the inside. And so it's another kind of knowledge. I must tell you immediately that I hope I am a pretty good translator, but I am a very bad English speaker because I translate English or Italian exactly like I translate Latin. And I cannot speak Latin. I will try to speak English. Well, the topic of the birth of individual awakening of consciousness, affirmation of self, your topic, is familiar to medievalists. Let's quote Marie-Dominique Chenu, The Awakening of Consciousness in the Medieval Civilization, or the famous book of Caroline Bynum, Metamorphosis and Identity, in 2005. So doing, medievalists reacted to a trend exemplified by Jacob Burckhardt, who referred to the Renaissance as the period of awareness of individuals' uniqueness. Medievalists, eager to defend their Middle Ages, situated the famous awakening at different times within their period. Eventually, the reader has the impression that individual consciousness awaked so many times in the history that it should fall asleep very often. If medievalists proposed other dating, they nevertheless remain, for the most part, in a teleological perspective. History would be summed up in the passage from a holistic society, of which the early Middle Ages would be the clearest expression, to an individualistic society, actually to us as we are now. I don't believe in this progressive vision, and that's why in the title of your seminar, I love the verb remaking, making and remaking the first person. The teleological approach is always a historical error, and one can observe phenomena that contradict the idea of a triumphal march towards the sovereign individual. The nationalisms and totalitarianisms of the 19th and 20th centuries had violently denied such a perspective. Today, the increasing importance of religions or communities, the definition of which is often narrower and narrower, but we hold a stronger and stronger ascendancy over their members, shows that the idea of the irresistible triumph of the individual is no longer self-evident. Far from creating a world village of universal citizens, globalization, at least in the current phase, has revived holistic behavior throughout the world and in the very heart of the West. I am not sure that St. Augustine had a lesser sense of his self than a modern soccer supporter. But maybe the author of the Confessions, St. Augustine, was a soccer supporter too. Thus, I will ask the question differently, starting from characters for whom Aviad and I had the same interest, the saints. Among the most remarkable personalities of the Western Middle Ages, one should mention emperors, kings, artists, but also a lot of saints. Benedict, Bernard, Francis, Dominic, Clare of Assisi, Catherine of Siena, and so on. I quote Aviad, sanctity implies separation, demarcation. The paradox is that these remarkable individualities are driven by the spring of imitation. Either the sequela Christi, and following Christ is to imitate the apostles, or the direct imitatio Christi, imitation of Christ. The saints also imitate each other. When Francis of Assisi donates his coat to a poor man, it's clear to his hagiographer, as to any reader of the 13th century, that he is imitating Saint Martin, and even surpassing him, since Martin had only given half of his coat. The identity of a saint is to be identical. Identical to a model, therefore, to have no identity of its own, an anti-self. I will not give my coat, but it's hot. The paradox was pushed to its limit by Nino Tamasia. It was the beginning of the 20th century. He identified all the biblical, patristic, or hagiographical sources in the first life dedicated to Francis, and reduced this text to a series of literary borrowings. And so the title is Francesco d'Assisi e la sua leggenda, but for him, Francis of Assisi, it is only a legend. And Jacques Le Goff himself asked the question, did St. Louis exist? For from the moment an author becomes a hagiographer, that is, writes a biography celebrating the glory of God in this particular saint, the account is inevitably cluttered with topoi, commonplaces that circulate from one legend to another, same words, same behaviors, same miracles. And it's why hagiographical literature has long been held in low esteem as a historical document. When a hagiographer had to write the life of a saint who had long since disappeared and about whom he had little information, I am sure that he drew copiously from the topoi mine. But women or men seeking to live a holy life made it their duty to conform to prestigious models. Francis really did give his coat, and he truly carried on his body the stigmata of Christ. In the second case, the stigmata, he was aware that he was acting out the epistle to the Galatians. I quote, for I bear on my body the marks of Jesus. And therefore, Francis was imitating Paul, imitating Christ. Was Francis aware that he was imitating Martin by giving his coat? If not, it was anyway the role of the hagiographer to highlight this parallel. If his saint dies on a Friday, the hagiographer will not fail to relate this death to Christ's passion. But, I add, maybe the saint abandons himself to death on a Friday rather than the day before or the day after, through conscious or unconscious imitation. As Aviad did in his Saint Stories, I will explore this paradox through the hagiographical files that are most familiar to me. Clare of Remini was an obscure penitent who lived in Italy between 13th and 14th century. Coming from a noble family, married twice, devoting herself to all the pleasures of the flesh, she converted and led a life of penance in her city, where she distinguished herself by her extravagances. Here is the worst of them. I read the source. Having heard that Jesus Christ prayed sweating blood, that he was slapped, his face stained with spit, his side pierced by the spear, his hands fixed to the wood of the cross by sharp nails, that a crown of pointed thorns was thrust into his head, and that vinegar were given to him to drink, Sister Clare wanted to make herself entirely an imitator of this patient. Also, on Good Friday, in the early morning, she hired two rascals. After having visited the bishopric of Remini, she ordered that they tie her hands tightly behind her back. The rascals led her with a rope around her neck. According to her wishes, they tied her to a stone column, and she remained bound until noon the following Saturday. Once the services were recited, they detached her from the column, with her hands still tied, the halter by her throat, dressed in her undergarments, asking to be beaten cruelly with branches or bare hands. She visited the churches of the city. And thus, every year on these days, she tortured her body the same way. She burned with such a fervent love for the Passion of our Lord that no one would have been sufficient for her punishment and correction. Finally, prohibited from continuing this practice by the sisters, she gave up the use of the rascals and similar public acts of suffering. A few days later, conferring with the sisters, she told them that of all the painful martyrdoms suffered in her life, this one was the worst. Clare's behavior is a scandal, hence the pressure from the sisters to renounce this exhibition. And it's her renunciation which was her most painful martyrdom. But her way of the cross is nothing else than the representation of Christ's passion. The scandal here comes from the fact that the role of Christ is played by a woman, and the macerations she carries out, barely clothed, are public. It's a challenge to patriarchal ideology which wants woman's place to be at home. An ideology that the Italian communes often cited as a model of democratic rebirth, in fact reinforced by confiscating all civic life for the exclusive benefit of men. Since 1260, these Italian cities were crossed by processions of penitents who whipped each other. But women could not take part in these demonstrations, and if they wanted to engage in such austerity, it had to be at home, in secret. In the case of Clare of Remini, her Imitatio Christi comes up against a social code. The legend telling Clare's life is also a transgression since it's the first hagiographical text ever written directly in Italian and not in Latin, in the lingua madre, and not in the paternal language of the clerics. Of this contradiction between the evangelical call and the social code, one have a more discreet example in the life of Rose of Viterbo, who died at the age of 18 in 1251. After receiving the penitent habit from the hands of a holy woman of the city, anonymous, she asked her mother to wake up all the female neighbors in the middle of the night and explain that the Virgin Mary had ordered her to go to 3 churches in the city, and so they did the next day. This procession is obviously less scandalous than that of Clare of Remini, since Rose seems to conform here to the imitation of Mary, not of Mary's son. But let's listen to the rest. Since a crowd of people continuously went to the house of Rose to see her actions, her father began to threaten the Virgin and said to her, "If you do not abandon what you are doing, I will rip out all the hair of your head." The Virgin replied, "I do not care, because the hairs of the birth of Jesus Christ were torn away for us. For him, I am not afraid to endure such things." The father said, "If you don't stop, I will tie you up. I will tie you up." The Virgin replied, "Our Lord also was bound to the column. For his sake, I am not afraid of being bound." And she said to her father, "Do not contradict me." She's 17 years old. Even if you it's the right age. "Even if you contradict me, I will not stop, because the Lord has commanded me to do this." The father then began to cry and say, "Daughter, do as you please, with God's blessing." Let's take a subtler example of imitatio Christi in the case of the more famous saint Clare of Assisi, who was converted by Francis in 1211 and died in 1253. The episode is told in her canonization process. One time, while she was washing, yes, you have it on the screen. One time, while she was washing the feet of one of the servant sisters of the monastery of San Damiano, close to Assisi, she turned to kiss her feet. That sister clumsily withdrew her foot, and thus, while putting it away, she hit the Holy Mother in the mouth with her foot. Nevertheless, because of her humility, Clare did not desist, but kissed the sole of the foot of the servant. The gesture of washing the feet is inspired by the account of the Last Supper. On Thursday evening, Jesus, I quote the Gospel, poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. This gesture, Christ's gesture, is already a transgression, since when Peter's turn comes, he shouts out, you shall never wash my feet." The apostle feels that the master should not humiliate himself in front of the disciple. In the time of Clare of Assisi, the gesture of washing the feet has become ritual. In the Holy Thursday liturgy, the abbot of Cluny, for example, performs the ceremony of the mandatum and washes the feet of the poor. It's a ritualization of Imitatio Christi, to which the Pope still now devotes himself today, each year, each Holy Thursday. The scene is more complex in the case of Clare, because a woman takes the place of Christ. It will be objected that she does not play so much Christ's role. Rather, she does her duties as an abbess. But Clare's legend tells us that she did not want this title of abbess. I quote, no, it's following. 3 years I don't find it. Well, sorry, it's not on the screen. 3 years after her conversion, declining the name and office of abbess, she wished in her humility to be placed under others rather than above them, and among the servants of Christ to serve more willingly than to be served, compelled by Blessed Francis. However, she accepted the government of the ladies. In the monastic tradition, every elected person must decline the honor bestowed on him or her. But since Abba, you know better than me, means father, the title of abbot is in contradiction with the word of Christ, who says, "Do not call anyone on earth father, for you have only one Father, and he is in heaven." Abbess, moreover, does not mean mother, but it's the feminization of a paternal masculine title. Let's return to the scene of the washing of feet by Clare, but now from the point of view of the servant. The sisters of San Damiano were divided into two categories: ladies, all from noble families, and servant sisters of more modest social extraction. The servant sisters, less aware than Clare of the liturgical subtleties and of the text of St. John's Gospel, is shocked that the abbess washes her feet and then kisses them, because she has integrated the values of the aristocratic ideology that dominates her, and she does not understand this inversion of roles, as Peter did not understand it on the part of Christ. Moreover, the kiss on the feet is not inspired by Holy Thursday, but by the gesture of the female sinner anointing the feet of Christ. Clare's gesture is doubly evangelical, but it's also a double transgression. Transgression of clerical ideology, a woman plays Christ, and of aristocratic ideology, a lady washes the feet of a servant, a noble plays the role of the beach. Here, to be clear now, here is the sequence of my hypothesis. First hypothesis. The Christian religion is the dominant religion of the Western Middle Ages. Until now it works. But it shares the field of value systems with various ideologies: patriarchal, aristocratic, civic, clerical ideology, and so on. By religion, I mean a belief system and by Christian religion, the belief system inspired by the gospel. But all around the evangelical message has been built a complex machinery, institutional with the church, doctrinal with the scripts of the father and the theologian, plus many compromises between the faith of the clerics and the faith of the people. By ideology, I mean a system of value aimed at affirming the identity and, I add, ensuring the domination of a social category. It's something to discuss, obviously, but it's my hypothesis. It's my vocabulary. The Christian religion is absolutely dominant in the medieval West. Not exclusive, but dominant. It's enough to see how the adherents of other beliefs are treated. Unbelievers, unfaithful, heretics, Satan's henchmen. But Christianity cannot be a real ideology because in its core, the evangelical message, it advocates non-domination. Moreover, to manifest its activity and its truth, Christian religion needs to come up against other value systems. It exists against worldly values, and there must be a world versus which Christianity may define itself as the opposite. The Christian religion is not a revolutionary ideology, it's just disturbing. When Christ proclaims, "So the last will be the first and the first will be the last," it implies that there must be first and last in order that this inversion would work. The Christian religion needs contrary ideology. And it's not a weak ideology. It's the religion of weakness. As Nietzsche said, I quote Nietzsche, "Christianity has taken the part of all the weak, the low, the botched." The paradox of the Western Middle Ages is that in this period, a religion of losers has triumphed. Nevertheless, within the ecclesiastical institution, categorical ideologies may develop, clerical, monastic ideology. For example, the term abbot responds to a monastic ideology that wants to establish a hierarchy within the community and thus contradicts the evangelical message. Do not call anybody father. Second hypothesis. Holiness is imitation, but at the same time, it's transgression, demarcation. Since it's imitatio Christi, it must transgress worldly ideologies. Aviad observes that Ginepro, companion of Francis, refuses to act in accordance with conventional logic and receive social norms. Holiness is defined by these clashes between worldly and Christian values. It's in these clashes, thus, at the moment when the saint is the most mimetic, that they find the saints and express their individuality. They do not distinguish themselves by fighting in the name of an irreducible self against generalized holiness. The saints are not romantic heroes. They individualize themselves by putting evangelical message and ideologies in conflict. It's at the very moment when she merges with the persecuted Christ that Rose of Viterbo, in the ace of her father, finds herself, becomes someone, daughter, do as you please with God's blessing. As for Clare of Assisi, she wasn't recognized as a saint despite her conflicts with the papacy, but thanks to her conflicts with the papacy. Her legend recounts, you have it here, Pope Gregory IX loved this holy woman with a fatherly affection. When he was attempting to persuade her that because of the events of the times and the dangers of the world, she would consent to have some possessions, she resisted with a very strong spirit and would in no way acquiesce. To this, the Pope replied, "If you fear for your vow, we absolve you from it, the vow of poverty." "Holy Father," she said, "I will never in any way wish to be absolved from the following of Christ." The Pope, in the name of his pastoral care, which sounds here like a paternalistic ideology, defends the position, and Clare appears more evangelical than the Pope. It's at this precise moment that her fama sanctitatis asserts itself in her disobedience to the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Then she becomes Clara Claris praeclara meritis, Clare brilliant by her bright merits, as the bull of canonization will say in 1255. Her name, Clare, is made in the same time common and proper, transparent and unique. I have so far taken examples of holy women because one can see that gender both complicates and makes the transgressions of holiness more obvious. But the fundamental transgression is the same with holy men. The first of the male saints I will evoke, Robert of Arbrissel, my old friend, was interested in the salvation of women. Born in Brittany around 1045, he was the son of a priest and takes over his father's parish. Then he embarked on an itinerant preaching followed by a troop of disciples of both sexes that caused a scandal. And he was severely reproached by the local bishops, whereas Jesus himself was followed by holy women. Robert eventually established his community at Fontevraud in western France, dividing them between men and women, but he was still accused of sharing the nun's bed to test his chastity. It's not a very good idea. His disciples called their leader only masters, says his legend, since he wanted to be called neither lord nor abbot. So he's very evangelical. Shortly before his death, Robert entrusted the leadership of the mixed community not to a man, but to a woman. Not to a virgin, but to a woman who knew men, which could only be felt at the beginning of the 12th century as the choice of a double indignity. Here is an episode of Robert's life that I had the good fortune to discover. That's the most beautiful text I know. One day, he, Robert, came to a place called Menley to preach in this monastery. The people of the country told him that women could not go into the church, and if any one of them presumed to enter, she would die at once. Learning this, the Lord's good servant, Robert, led in several women against the will of those who stood watch at the doors. and showed them before all present that their lies were impious. Then the doorkeepers began devoutly to beg Saint Menle, the local saint, and to cry aloud that it should please him to take vengeance of such insult. The holy man replied, "Simple people, do not continue in vain such foolish prayers. Know that the saints are not the enemies of the brides of Jesus Christ. For what you are saying is absurd, and the purity of the Catholic faith clearly says the opposite, as it's written in the Gospel, concerning the blessed sinful woman who kissed the feet of her Redeemer, washed them with her tears, dried them with her hair, and poured ointment on his very worthy head." And so, who dares to say that there should be any church into which a woman is not permitted entry if she not be forbidden by reason of her faults and sins? It means her own faults. Which is the greater thing? God's material temple or the spiritual temple in which God lives? It means the body of a woman. If a woman takes and eats the body and blood of Jesus Christ, think what folly it is to believe that she may not enter a church. That's really, for me, it's really gorgeous. Robert defends the brides of Jesus Christ on behalf of the purity of the Catholic faith and in the name of the female sinner who kissed Christ's feet with a magnificent exaltation of the body as God's temple. Yet, he is not confronted with local superstition. We would have said that in the 70s, with the popular religion and etc., and l'histoire des mentalités. It would have been something, a conflict between educated and popular cultures. But not at all. That's just the strict application of the monastic enclosure. My last saint. Born around 1181, Francis of Assisi was the son of a merchant, and he began by exercising his father's job. So he went to sell fabrics in Foligno. His first life tells. There, after selling everything he brought, this successful merchant even left behind the horse he was riding when he had obtained his prize. Returning toward Assisi, he came across a church, it's always San Damiano, on the side of the road. He found a poor priest there, kissed his holy hands, offered him the money he was carrying, and explained his purpose. The priest was astounded, and he refused to believe that what he was hearing. Finally, he agreed to let Francis stay in the church, but out of fear of Francis's parents, did not accept the money. The true scorner of wealth, Francis, threw it, the money, onto a window opening, since he cared for it as much as he cared for dust, and in other passages is for shit. The priest cannot believe in Francis's evangelical behavior, whereas the latter only applies the precept of Christ to the young rich man, which is the key of all the conversions. I quote, "If you want to be perfect, go sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come and follow me." The priest actually has internalized and accepts the dominant social ideology, fearing the rich family of the young merchant. Francis's father, indeed, cannot support his son's new behavior. He finds the money thrown at San Damiano and demands that Francis return everything he has received from him. And this is the famous scene you know in which Francis takes off all his clothes in the presence of the Bishop of Assisi. Francis' father, Peter, is himself torn between two ideologies. I love him, the father, because I am a father, so I can understand him. Imagine if you have a son like Francis. You are absolutely, no, that's awful. I will be a saint. Oh, yes, but Peter, the father, is a merchant, and his goal is obviously to earn as much money as possible. He teaches Francis the fabric trade, but he has other ambitions for his sons. As a merchant, he may inspire fear in a poor priest and dominate the more deprived, but in the city of Assisi, he is one of the minores, while the nobles, bearing the title of knight, possessing castle and fortified houses in the city, ruling as consul in the commune, form the category of the maiores. Peter's dream is that his sons, at least two, should rise a notch above him and become nice, normal merchants. Francis's gesture, throwing the proceeds from the sale, makes his father doubly angry. As a merchant, he deplores the money lost, but as someone aspiring to nobility, he deplores the fact that he was thrown away without a witness. The essential value of nobility is largesse. In order to distinguish themselves from the other people, nobles must show that they don't value money and can pour it down the drain, but not into the dusty window of a deserted country church. For nobles, largesse must have witnesses and shine in the eyes of the others. Listen to another life of Francis, the legend of the three companions. When he grew up, he pursued his father's profession, that of a merchant. He was, however, vastly different from his father. He was more good-natured and generous, given over to revelry and song with his friends, roaming day and night throughout Assisi. He was most lavish in spending, so much so that all he could possess and earn was squandered on feasting. Because of this, his parents often reprimanded him, telling him that he spent so much money on himself and others that he seemed to be the son of some great prince rather than their son. But since his parents were wealthy and loved him very much, they tolerated all these things to avoid upsetting him. Not only. There is a clear indication of a conflict between ideologies in the very minds of Francis's parents. But it is not by passing from commercial ideology to chivalrous ideology that he becomes someone, Francis. It's only when he gets rid of everything in front of the Bishop of Assisi, when he renouncing having in order to win at being, having things in order to win at being someone. When, according to the first slide, he wrestles naked with the naked. It's a reference to nudus nudum Christum sequi, following naked, the naked Christ. his brother Angelo, who completed social ascent to chivalry, we know that thanks to the archives, would be forgotten by everybody if he were not the brother of the famous Poverello. Then Francis begins to restore the church of San Damiano. Here is the account of the legend of the Three Companions. While he was working at restoring the church, he wanted to have a lamp burning continually in the church, so he went through the city begging for oil. But when he was approaching a certain house, he saw a group of men gathered for a game. Ashamed to beg in front of them, he backed away. Mulling it over, he accused himself of having sinned. Hurrying back to the place where they were playing, he told everyone standing around his fault, that he was ashamed to beg because of them. He entered that house and, for the love of God, begged in French for oil for the lamps of that church. Francis is ashamed to beg, especially since he knows very well these men. They are his former companions, the golden youth of Assisi, whom he had once joined in the hope of becoming a knight. The legend proposes a very beautiful resolution of Francis' dilemma. He returns to the place, but by asking for oil in French, he transforms the begging into a quest for the Holy Grail, because French was then at once the noble language of the courts of chivalric romances. Francis, so doing, is no longer a rotten beggar. He becomes the wandering knight of the only worthwhile Lord Christ. Yet, I have some doubts about this version, because here is another episode, the last one, in the same legend of the Three Companions. Francis has not yet become a penitent. At this time, he happened to go to Rome on pilgrimage. As he was entering the church of St. Peter, he noticed the meager offering made by some. With great enthusiasm, he took a handful of coins from his money pouch and threw them through a grating of the altar, making such a loud noise, that all the bystanders were astonished of this generosity, largesse. As he was leaving and passed the door of the church, where there were many poor people begging alms, he secretly exchanged clothes with one of those poor people and put them on him. Standing on the steps of the church with the other poor, he begged for alms in French, because he would speak French spontaneously. All thought, it's always the hagiographer, he did not do so correctly. French is used again, and Francis has a perfectly noble attitude when he throws his money very visibly, very loudly to the altar. But I was lucky enough to find a previously unpublished life of Francis of Assisi earlier than the legend of the Three Companions. This rediscovered life tells the same story, but not in the same way. It's the last excerpt. When he was still in the world, he had come to Rome as a merchant with merchandise, and saw many beggars and poor who resided near the Basilica of St. Peter. Feeling compassion for them, compassion is strong in the Middle Ages, that's passion with. He wanted to experience their miseries and see if he would be able to tolerate these things for a while. Unknown to his companions, he set aside his own clothes and clothed himself with the putrid clothes of the suffering. Coming among them, he sat down and begging, not in French, he cheerfully ate with them. The differences between the two accounts are obvious. According to the rediscovered life, the true one, the true episode, Francis does not go to Rome on pilgrimage, but on a business trip. And is not in a slow process of conversion, but is suddenly seized by the spectacle of misery. He does not throw money at the altar, does not beg in French, but wants to share the condition of the poor. With this marvelous expression, experience their misery. Not only does he exchange his clothes with them, but he shares their filthy meals. All noble arrogance has disappeared, and he shows typically evangelical behavior. Since the author of the Legend of the Three Companions sees fit to rewrite and modify the account, it means that he cannot accept the raw violence of the initial episode and needs to hide it with a varnish of worldly ideology to turn an evangelical saint into a hero of chivalry. The author of the legend was a very close companion of Francis and should share the Franciscan value of absolute humility, but he has kept something of his former chivalric ideology and cannot refrain from suggesting that he speaks better French than Francis himself. Pride. Making and remaking the self. In the history of holiness, more broadly in the history of the medieval West, and perhaps in the history to court, there is no period without an individual consciousness, which would be followed by a moment of awakening of consciousness, a forming of the self and use of the first person. There is, in my opinion, a permanent conflict of value systems. Actually, self must constantly be reinvented. I would gladly apply to it what Jacques says about the event, because the event and the individual have in common that they make the singular emerge. This, I quote Rancière, this scandal of the event is that of the conflagration of discourses and the confusion of time periods. The event draws its paradoxical novelty from that which is tied to something restated, to something stated out of context, inappropriately. The impropriety of expression is also an undue superimposition of time periods. The event has the novelty of the anachronistic. When I was a child, I went to Mass each Sunday with my family, and I listened attentively to the readings from Holy Scripture. For example, this passage, which struck me so strongly. Do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Look at the birds in the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. And why do you worry about clothes? See how the flowers of the field grow. They do not labor or spin, yet none, even Solomon, in all his splendor, was dressed like one of these. Then we came back home and had our Sunday lunch. In the afternoon, my parents asked me, have you done your homework for next week? This is what is called a double bind or a paradoxical injunction, the best way to make someone crazy. I don't know if I am crazy. I am no longer a believer, and I know that I will not be a saint. But I am sure that here, in this paradox, here is myself.
Thank you for this wonderful lecture. Questions?
My name is Sergi, and very interesting lecture. And as I understand, one of your main hypotheses in the lecture was that to become a saint in the Middle Ages was to imitate the Christ, Jesus Christ. So I would like to ask you, how would you? I know that Joan of Arc was one of the Christian saints. She became one of the Christian saints, but she, as far as I understand, she didn't imitate the Christ. She became the saint because she fought the French troops, and because of her, she became the saint because of her heroic deeds, not imitating the Jesus. How would you explain it?
It's a marvelous question. Thank you very much. The answer is very simple. Joan of Arc is not a medieval saint. She was canonized in 1920, after the First World War. She's not a medieval saint. She's a medieval character. She's a medieval person, woman. But she's a very contemporary saint. And it was, I study the process of the canonization of the 19th and 20th century. And what you say was exactly the main problem. Papacy wanted to, how can I say, to do a gift to France for many complicated reasons. But it was very difficult to show that Joan was a saint because she was a warrior and she does not imitate Christ at all. But she's not a medieval saint. She's a saint of the 20th century. The process started in the years 1860s, and it was ended in 1920. For exactly the reason you say, she was not a medieval saint. If you, if you are interested, you will give me your email address, and I will send you a paper I wrote about that.
Thanks so much. This is a marvelous lecture. And you can imagine that when one of the highlights of teaching a medieval course here is quoting this part of the Sermon on the Mount, and then telling students this is not an excuse for not delivering your papers on time. I usually emphasize this part. But I was wondering about those two last quotes. And clearly we know what's earlier and what's later. But as accounts of the making and the remaking of the self, I clearly like the first one better. It is inconsequent. We have Francis, who's playing with different roles, who's not actually moving in a clear progression, in a clear direction. His use of French might be a way of taking the posture, and of course this is the family origins as well, but also a way of keeping distance when you are making out, when you're actually pretending to be one of the beggars, but you're clearly not. So distance has to be combined here with identification and imitation. And because it is in a way messier, less exemplary than the earlier account of Tommaso di Celano, because he retains so much of what he was. So it's two accounts of moments in the process of conversion. Actually, the old text in the legend seems to me still worth the trouble exploring. Now, I was wondering whether the new text, the rediscovered text, how does it fit into the larger narrative?
Yes.
I mean, can we, given that I may be wrong or not about the observation about the text, how does it fit in the story? Is there a narrative line?
Well, thank you very much. It's complicated because, to be clear, the oldest legend, it means the legend which was redacted the first, was discovered the last. So when I say the new legend, I want to say the newly discovered legend, but actually it is older than the legend of the three companions. Well, just to give you a framework, Francis died in 1226. He was canonized in 1228. The first legend, the first life, was written by Thomas of Celano in 1229, immediately after the canonization, and some years afterwards, in the 30s, I cannot say more, in the 30s, the general minister, Brother Elia, tells Thomas of Celano, well, your legend, okay, but she's too long. She's too long. She's annoying, I don't know. According to me, she's too long for liturgy, you know? Because during the liturgy, you must read something of the saint's life, but it must be short excerpt. And so he obliged Thomas to write again his life, but shorter. And in my opinion, it's still a debate because I discovered it in 2014. But in my opinion, it's the second life ever written on Francis of Assisi. Afterwards, in 1246, was written the legend of the three companions. The fact which is very interesting, the legend of the three companions was very likely written by one of the closest companions of Francis. We have a debate too, because you know, specialists of Franciscan studies, to pretend to be important, they have a lot of debates. So we are debating about everything, about the title of the legends, about everything, about the dating, about the author. It's like, you know, it's like biblical studies. We know that. Well, he was very close. The author of the Legend of the Three Companions, actually, there were not three companions, it was only one author, but he was a companion. He was very close to Francis. I am sure that the episode of beginning in St. Peter, like it's told, like it's written in my rediscovered legend, is the authentic account of the authentic episode, the authentic story. It means Francis is not at all somebody who will become a saint. He is on business trip with businessmen, and you know, oh, we'll go to Rome, we will see the great city and the little ladies, etc., etc. Well, but he sees the poor. He sees the poor, and oh, he does not throw away his money. He does not beg. He does not speak French. He wants to experience their condition. That's gorgeous. When I saw, you know, it's a manuscript which is very difficult to read. When I deciphered that, to experience their poverty, wow! I said, 3 words, that's gorgeous. In the Legend of the Three Companions, this episode is so strong that it was rewritten, and rewritten with more worldly varnish. The very strange thing is that in the rediscovered life, to answer your question. In the rediscovered life, this episode does not come to the logical place in the timing of the biography of Francis. It comes at the end. And according to me, it's a memory that a companion comes to tell Thomas, I read your first slide, but you forgot. You have forgotten something. You didn't say about St. Peter in Thomas said, I am sorry, I was not present. And he told me, I was not present too, but he told me that, how he was seized by the vision of the poor. And so it's why in the rediscovered legend, the episode does not fit at the right place. It arrives after, like a kind of, I was forgetting to tell you, you know. Whereas in the Legend of the Three Companions, it falls exactly at the right place. And according to me, the fact that it falls at the right place is just the evidence, or at least the clue, that it was rewritten and reordered. I don't know if I answered.
Perhaps a short comment, because we don't want to get too deeply into this, as I'm afraid that most of this audience has not read any of the life of St. Francis. Nevertheless, I think one should be, it is obvious that the second, well, the earliest, or the new life of the rediscovered life presents something that is more palatable to us and seems to us more authentic. But I think God is right in feeling that we should be very careful not to assume that since this is the real Francis, then this is the historical Francis. And I think if you just remember that Francis, here's this has something to do with what Sergei was saying. One of the episodes that is always forgotten, completely obliterated from the memory of St. Francis of Assisi is that he was a soldier, that he fought in a war against Perugia, that he was a prisoner of war. We don't know exactly what he did, but wars are war. I mean, he bore weapons, he may have killed, maimed, wounded people. This is completely and totally forgotten. The only Francis we remember is the Francis preaching to the bird, is the Francis giving up everything, and I think Francis was perhaps both. I think I can empathize and sort of identify with Gandhi's doubts. First episode, not very Franciscan, probably true. Second episode, too Franciscan.
That's true.
Not. Yes. Yes, more questions. Yes, please. Just introduce yourself. I forgot to do this.
Thank you for your talk. It was fascinating. My name is Michal, and I'm a PhD student in the School of History, and I study contemporary saints in India. So I'm thinking about the act of imitation in sainthood in general, in a more modern sense. And sometimes I get the feeling that the act of imitation, which I also see in my saints.
Who do they imitate?
They imitate
The gods?
mainly the gods.
The gods.
Some of them are reincarnation of the gods. They imitate places. They copy places from the Himalaya into Delhi. There is lots of act of copying and imitating. But I have this feeling, and I got it also here, that the act of imitation is not about making a self or remaking a self. It's about expanding the self.
Explain
Because especially with the women's saint, I could relate more because also my saints are feminine, most of them, not all. But it's about agency. So in order to expand, like those women were forbidden doing certain things according to society, and then they did something. And they did something very specifically. They imitate a saint. Jesus is a saint, okay? And by doing that, they could expand the agency they had at this period of time. And by doing that, they expand their self. And by expanding the self, they became saints. This is what is saintly about them, that this self is expanded.
Yes. it's a dialectic between, no, I agree absolutely with you. It's a kind of dialectic between imitation and being someone singular. It's singularity, uniqueness. It's very, very difficult. I mean, it's difficult for us to be someone, no? Wow. You said something very deep, and it's difficult to answer. I will answer with a little story, because I am not a historian. I am a historian, as somebody who tells story. I have a very good friend of mine. He was the dean of the School of Theology in the Antonianum. It means the Franciscan University in Rome. He was the successor of Bonaventure.
Antonianum, because called after St. Anthony of Padua.
Yes, he's the Studium Generale. He was the successor of Bonaventure. And he's a great intellectual, a big brain. And in the same time, he's a rebel. He does not like authority of the others. He does not like to obey. And so it's why I say he was the dean, because finally the hierarchy of the others said, oh, stop, go away, you are dismissed. But I want to say that this is somebody who has all the characteristic of a very strong personality, big intellectual, and a kind of rebel, a strong personality. When I lived in the convent of the Antonianum, I was the first lay person who lived in the convent. My cell was close to his cell, and so he invited me often in the evening to drink something and to have chats and chats. And in his room, there were two pictures, exactly at the same level. Francesco and Francesco.
Who's the other one?
Francesco of Assisi, Francis of Assisi, and Francesco Totti, the footballer. And I told him, but you put them at the same level? He said, yes, because I cannot distinguish Francesco and Francesco. And when he was watching the TV, he was no more the same man. He was a kind of awful supporter, you know, Roma, Roma, Roma. And if he would have encountered somebody of the Lazio, the other team of Rome, he would have killed him. He was self, and in the same time, in other moments of the same day, he became just a supporter. That's gorgeous for me. But it means also many things. When I am studying a society, a big society or a micro society, for example, the first companions of Francis. Well, Angelo, Rufino, Tommaso, Elia, they were in the same part, in another part. We are reflecting like political parties, you know, left, right, center. But my friend, he was in the same time very close to other theologians and very close to supporters of la Roma, perché siamo tutti della Roma e quindi e non vogliamo bene alla Lazio, you know.
Because we're all pro, and therefore we don't like Lazio.
And so it means that you have some, how can I say, underground relationships which are very difficult to catch when you do, before having seen the two Francesco in the cell. So that's the problem of, we become someone imitating someone else in the wrong moment.
More questions? Perhaps I will ask a question there. This has to do with, again, with St. Clare of Assisi. Okay, let's go back for those of you who don't know, or Francis, I mean, goes on as, I mean, begin. By the way, one of the interesting things about the new life is that what we would consider the most, because of John, the most center aspects of the Franciscan story of conversion, the scene before the bishop is absent from that version, which is quite shocking and amazing in itself. It tells us something about what other people, and by the way, it's totally absent from Francis's own account of what happened to him. He does not mention that. It's one of those places where art had a deep influence on the way that we think of things. So he becomes a saint, and his deep or his main insight is absolute poverty, which again is by imitation of Christ, but which has nothing to do with the original. Christ has never begged for alms. He has never gone knocking from door to door asking for food or money. This is Francis as Christ. Okay, so he has this notion. And then he has this sort of platonic affair with Claire. And one evening she runs away from her parents' house and she shows up at the church, at the Porziuncola, isn't it? Yes, at the church of the brothers, which is a very small church. Sort of
Alla Porziuncola, sì,
the
sì.
outskirts of the city now in Santa Maria degli Angeli. So she shows up. He does something that is totally wrong.
Canonically wrong.
Canonically wrong. He cuts off her hair, which is only a bishop is allowed to do that. Okay, so in a way he makes a friar, and for one night she is a Franciscan friar, which is what she wants to be. She wants to be a Franciscan friar. Francis instead makes sure that within his order there are no fathers and there are no masters, because masters are called ministers, so servants. Everybody calls each other brothers, not fathers. So this, okay. And she wants to be like that, and she wants to go from door to door, etc. Then he says, God did not rid us of our fathers to give us ladies. Okay, these things. No, he puts her within the convent, cloistered, not begging, not going from door to door, not preaching, not a sister, a lady, an abbess. So the whole idea, the whole Franciscan idea, is at the same time a total disruption of rules and an imposition of rules on. This is
For the other.
for women, especially
For
women especially, and and the way she looks, the whole way her whole feeling in some way, her whole being is sort of a combination of frustration at that thing, including, probably one of that Sinclair is the patron saint of television.
Yes, it's true. She had a vision.
Yes, and one Easter, she really it doesn't allow her to leave the church. One Easter, she really longed to be with the brothers celebrating Easter. She could not do this, of course. Francis comes to tell her how it was. She says, I have seen it in the eyes of my spirit. I have seen every aspect of it. I've seen everything. So that sort of barring away, not allowing, making you a spectator and not a participant, a very limited type of imitator, imposing, which the Pope does not. The Pope does not impose his rules of unpoverty on her. He allows her to be poor, but Francis does not allow her. So I think this combination, I would say, of these two scenes of a person who obviously, and I share that admiration for Francis, who's in some ways his own version of himself, or his own new version of himself, is probably, I would agree, probably the closest thing we have to a successful evangelical imitation in the history of the West. And at the same time, the same person is disallowing, stopping, barring, forcing a very different, hierarchical, patriarchal idea on the woman supposedly closest to him. So I think perhaps that is something you might want to.
Yes, I thank you very much, Javier, because it's so important. I didn't think about that, but you just showed that these contradictions are also internal contradictions of Francis, between a very evangelical vision when he is concerned and a very not evangelical but patriarchal, clerical vision, when monastic tradition, when it's clear. And it's why I love so much the text of Robert of Arbrissel, because it does not follow gospel only for him. And the defense of human body through the Eucharist. It's something, you can believe or not in Eucharist, that's not the problem. It's what you say in the central God, it means that the reasoning which is marvelous. Even if you do not believe, the reasoning is marvelous. So this text of Robert of Arbrissel, according to me, is very much stronger than the behavior of Francis concerning Claire. On another point, I wanted to answer to your previous intervention. Precisely, the episode of the battle close to Perugia, where Francis was captured, it's told in the Legend of the Three Companions. Why? Because the author, according to me, was a former knight, and so he was very receptive to all the episode with a noble or chivalric character, and even he transformed some episode in chivalric stories. An archaeologist told me that he made an experience. He was on a field with young students. Some ones were studying antiquity, other ones Middle Ages, and someone's Greek antiquity, other one Roman antiquity. And they went together, it was in Sicily, they went together, and each time they saw a little piece of ceramic, they took it. At the end of the day, the specialist of Greek civilization had only found Greek ceramic. The specialist of Roman antiquity had only found Roman ceramic. The specialist of medieval, etc., etc. And I think that an hagiographer can do exactly the same thing. And this is the great resolution of Arsenio Frugoni when he says, what do we have in history? We have sources, nothing else. We have sources. We do not have immediately the historical truth. Even in a chart, even in an act, even in a verbal, it's always something mediatisé. And Arsenio Frugoni says the historical truth is somewhere in the middle, with all this regard croisé and crossing eyes. It's true until a certain moment. It's true until a certain moment. And it's why Giovanni Micoli or Carlo Ginzburg did not accept to go too far with the teaching of their master. Arsenio Frugoni was a master of Micoli and of Ginzburg. Because at a certain moment, facts happened or not. If you say that somebody has a hole in the middle of the hand, it's not because I have a chivalric culture or a clerical culture. There was or there was not. And you know what is exactly the question behind that. The question is a question of negationism. And it's why Ginzburg and Micoli are so attentive, so aware of the danger. It means that the idea of Arsenio Frugoni, of a kind of polyphonical history, a polyphony, a symphony of the sources, is marvelous until it reaches the point where you could negate the reality of an event. And this is unacceptable. I started my career as an historian in the same time when negationism started in France. And for me, this is the most important, even when you are a medievalist, to find where is the discourse and where is the reality. Oh, the reality does not exist. See, yes, it exists. It exists. But everybody has his own way to catch it. Okay, I agree. But there is a fact. Somebody died or was alive. And the father of Carlo Ginzburg died. You know that. Sorry, I am very...
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.